Human ecology. Ecology is defined as, let me get set up here. Ecology is defined as a branch of biology. Let's try that again. Ecology is defined as a branch of biology that studies the relationships between organisms and their environment, examining the interactions between organisms and their physical surroundings, and the relationships between different species within ecosystems. Ecology seeks to understand how organisms adapt to their environment and how they interact with each other and with non-living elements such as air, water, soil, and climate. Okay, so to define ecology is sort of a complex task in and of itself. The key focuses of ecology include population dynamics, okay, community structure, okay, so how a species lives and how many of them there are, energy flow, okay, let's circle back to that one, nutrient cycling, and the distribution and abundance of different species. So population dynamics, their distribution and abundance. So I guess how they reproduce is embedded in that, how many of them there are at any given time of the year, and how they're distributed, where they live, what areas, and how many of them there are, their abundance. Community structure, so how they live in relation to one another. Energy flow and nutrient cycling, that's interesting. Energy flow and nutrient cycling. So every living species is sort of embedded within this web of energy, right? If you're thinking very sort of big picture, seeing the earth as this tiny little, almost a contained organism in and of itself, and then within the earth is all these different components, all the biodiversity, and each thing interacts with each other thing in certain ways. Food systems, you're consuming something and then you release waste products, and then that waste interacts with the environment in a certain way. Everything is connected, right? Within cells, interlinked. So that's sort of nutrient cycling and energy flow. Energy flow, how organism uses its energy, how it attains its energy. All of these things are complex. Shortened. Ecology is the study of how living organisms interact with their environment and each other. It focuses on adaptation, relationships between species, and the influence of non-living factors like air, water, soil, and climate. How do humans fit into this? So let's give a backstory about my ideas and my thinking within this realm. I started working at the zoo about 3 years ago, and my role within the zoo is not working with the animals. I'm not a zookeeper in that traditional sense, or as we call it, the animal care department, doing animal husbandry, or even into the realm of like veterinarian services or cleaning or caring for the animals in any ways. You know, that's not what I do there. I work with the humans. Okay, so you can see where my thinking starts to go with this. If I was a zookeeper, I would have had to study the biology, the ecology of the different animals that I'm working with. I would need to know something about primate behaviors, their adaptations, what they eat, how they survive, if I was working with the gorillas, for example. I've gained a decent understanding of that. I could not do any veterinarian services on any animal whatsoever, but I could certainly figure out how to feed them, what to feed them. I could give a pretty good educated guess. If there was suddenly an apocalypse and I was the only person in the entire zoo left to feeding the animals and caring for them in that regard, I could do it based on the education that I have received working around them and reading and learning and studying. But I would be lost as to how to do any sort of medical procedures on animals. So the intricate biology aside, I could be a zookeeper in some sense at this point. But nonetheless, my role there has been working with the humans. What does it mean working with the humans? Well, talking to them, teaching them about the animals, guiding the humans in many ways. This will be a long discussion, and many of which I will have on this podcast and through the content I produce, and eventually through the writing that I produce and that I'm so far working on as well. And the book that I have most closest to fruition currently is the book that I'm working on now during my time here in Iceland, where I am recording this and where I've been for the last month and where I will be for another month. My book, as it is shaping up, I think it'll be called Iceland as a Metaphor for the World. And in this, I think that I'm touching on the ecology of humans as it pertains to Iceland. So the history of Iceland. I have this very fun and really crude piece of paper here that I've literally written a sort of outline of the book. And so this has really been my experience in Iceland here and my last summer here. Writing about the history of Iceland as far as I've learned it, and the many questions that have come up with understanding the history of Iceland, and my own personal family ancestry through my Icelandic side, and then human migration. So as I've learned studying human geography and learning about different cultures and learning about the emigration of Iceland, I've realized that human migration is the story of Homo sapiens. I read this book called The Next Great Migration, which didn't really do much at all to extrapolate out about what the future of human migrations would look like, which is what I thought the book might be about. But it did talk about the eternal patterns of migration in all of humanity and the migration patterns that are going on today with different human populations. And it put forth an idea that our species name, instead of Homo sapien, which I believe translates to something like wise ape, Homo sapien, should perhaps be Homo migrato. So like, human migrating ape, maybe, wise migrating ape, because that's been the story of our evolution, is we've expanded all around the globe, and that's really what makes us so unique. And it's maybe a chicken and the egg thing, right? Which came first? Was it that humans became wise as a species, we became creative, intelligent, and then using our intelligence, we're able to spread throughout the globe? Or was it because of our migration patterns, going out on the frontiers and on the margins of our known territory and expanding outward into new ecosystems, into literally new worlds, that this spurred along our development, intellectually speaking, and made us into the, quote, wise ape that we are today? And certainly you could trace out, and anthropologists, evolutionary biologists have done this, and you can research these things. I can't quote these off the top of my head as it sits now. I would like to be able to, but I'm sitting in a house full of books, and it's overwhelming to say the least. There's too many books and not enough time. That's a Frank Zappa quote. Too many books, too little time, something like that. And it's fundamentally true. There's too much to learn, and really we don't have to learn it all. I know it often sounds like a cop-out to say you can Google something to learn it, but we do have this tool and we should take advantage of it. And I do have my laptop here. If I wanted to dedicate a bit more time to this, which I'm not for the sake of this podcast video here, but I could just research, when our brains reach the capacity that they are today. I think it's something like 200,000 years ago, maybe, was modern Homo sapien in terms of how we are today anatomically. Let me digress. Human migration is the eternal pattern of life. Okay, so going through all of that, that's sort of the start of the book. Okay, and then it goes through, it weaves in that through my travels in Iceland, the different places that I went, the university lectures I attended, the conversations I had with different people throughout the country and along my travels. And many of them cover these things that we're just talking about here now. Human migration, getting into more of the history specific to Iceland, which is a very fascinating story, and of course has been written about before, podcasts about it, but it's still relatively unknown. You go to different places in the world, they don't know the history of Iceland. You know, growing up myself, having Icelandic ancestry, I never learned the history of Iceland. I grew up in Canada through the school system there, and I would have learned more about, you know, the English like expansion and history of their empires and their populations, etc., or even the Irish through the Irish potato famine and learning about those certain histories. And, you know, of course, when North America was found, or when the Americas in general were found, Christopher Columbus, all those stories. But maybe I'd come across this before, but it wasn't really till being in Iceland that I realized how profound of a fact it was that the ancient Norse were here in North America 500 years before Columbus, quote, discovered the New World. And I was just reading today, and I'm going to research this, and maybe I will actually Google this as we talk. The ancient Basque people, which I didn't really know anything about. I'd maybe come across this term in my reading. Basques are a southwestern European ethnic group characterized by the Basque language, and they still exist today and speak a very specific dialogue, which is quite interesting. Discovery of America. They may have been coming here and fishing for cod. Chronicles of the period indicate that Basques first came to America in 1517, only 17 years before French explorer Jacques Cartier. However, some historians suggest that they made this journey before Christopher Columbus in 1492. So these are the things. You can Google certain questions and you get to an answer of, however, some historians suggest that maybe they made their journey before Christopher Columbus. You realize that nobody really knows anything for certain. And this to me was a profound realization and something that made me confident that there is something for me to write about. Me, some relatively uneducated person. Okay, I've started this out by talking about my experience at the zoo, and now I work with the humans, talking to people, giving presentations. And at the beginning I thought, who am I to be teaching people about gorillas? I have not studied gorillas in the wild, certainly, but let alone even in a classroom, I have not studied them. But, you know, every single day at the zoo is like going to school, and I'm conversing with university-trained ecologists, biologists, zoologists, and other really diverse and creative people. It's the most incredibly stimulating environment to be a part of. So much more engaging in many ways because it's dynamic and robust and wide-ranging than universities can be. Although I certainly enjoy spending time in universities, and I've enjoyed my studies here in Iceland. But going through all of this, I've realized that I have stuff that I can teach others, and I have stuff that I can learn from others, and I can be a part of this education process, because at the end of the day, whether I'm going to university, whether I get a PhD or not, depending on no matter which pathway I choose, if I'm open and educating myself, doing things like what I'm doing here in Iceland, living in an author's residence and working at a museum, doing podcasts, connecting with people, there's a lot to be educated on, and there's a lot of self-study one can do. And at the end of the day, all that matters is if you are truly learning and if you're truly curious. And so I've been writing and writing and writing, and the book that is shaping up, my Iceland book, Iceland as a Metaphor for the World, and certainly the other books that will be spurred on after this, or articles or blogs, whatever content I'm producing, whatever ideas I'm espousing. All of this will continue to come about as long as I follow my curiosity. And my curiosity, I think, can be summarized by a deep dive into the ecology of humanity. Let's sit with that for a moment. searching to discover the ecology of humanity. I think if you take ecology as a literal term and then say, what is the ecology of humans? You can't help but include in that literally everything. Economics, philosophy, our population dynamics as the definition of ecology puts forth, but even like our books, our education, our culture, our communities. Like, humans are so diverse, it's maddening. It's relatively simple enough to get a full picture of gorilla family dynamics, gorilla species dynamics. And even then, you start researching things and you realize there's a lot of unknowns with all sorts of species. Some are more well studied than others, and we can intuit different things about them and figure out scientific facts about different species, but then you realize a lot of animals, there's mystery and unknowns with them too. And of course, certainly, just like this Basque, did they discover the Americas before Columbus? Were they sailing over here before this fancy European technology that the Spanish people had and that the British had later on, and these sorts of things? The Vikings, of course, went to America. I think that's quite well established in the year 1002, I believe it was. Excuse me. Back to the book. Intertwining all of my travels and these different realizations, like the one I'm explaining here now, different dynamics of our world today comparing to 100 years ago, or 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago when people were traveling the world then. Today we fly all over the world and we don't even think twice about it. Today we have social media. How does that change how we interface with the world? Every step of the way, this group that I was traveling with, we're going to Instagram this, we're going to Snapchat that. This is how people travel today. Here I was with a group of young people my age, and we were curious. We were searching for something, searching for meaning, studying history, learning. But yet every step of the way, we're involved in our phones. We're documenting it not for scientific purposes, but for vanity purposes, to show others what we're doing, to make ourselves look cool. What dynamic how does that fit into the ecology of humanity today? The fact that we literally have external brains now, right? If you're typing out the ecology of humanity, you would have to talk about the fact that this unique species has external brains. They've generated artificial intelligence outside of their own intelligence that is arguably more smarter than any other species besides Homo sapiens themselves. We've created the second most intelligent species, quote unquote, in this entire earth. Not to discredit whales and such. And, I have a whole bit and a whole dialogue on whales. I'm in here in Iceland, and, if I stare out long enough in this fjord, I'm bound to see some spouts. Just yesterday, a whale came into the harbor. So, I'm inclined to believe that there's a lot of intelligence with whales as well. I attended a National Geographic talk last year from Brian Scarry, who talks about his studies of the culture of whales and their languages and all these sorts of things. Now, extrapolations out into the future. That is sort of the through line of my book. Taking my current experiences with the dynamics I just talked about, social media and traveling the world on a plane and not thinking twice about it, being able to go anywhere in the entire world, whereas our ancestors just 50 to 100 years ago had to take these grueling boat trips. And before that, it was like literally going out into the unknown. Before the Irish found Iceland, and then later before the Norse found Iceland, this was just a mythical land called Thule, or Thule, a word from the ancient Greeks, which obviously some Greek explorer would have came far enough north to find Iceland or have an intuition about Iceland. Going out into the unknown. Today, the only unknown that exists is out in space, and that's sort of the essence, the finality of my book. The conclusion is, maybe we ought to find a way to get off this planet, and maybe going to Mars is not the best option. Maybe we can discover a new aspects to physics that can get us out there, and certainly I don't need to be the first to say it, but you just look online at all the talk about UFOs and these sorts of things, and it's not conspiratorial. If you scoff at this, then you're mistaken. These are real government agencies that are talking about these things. But the conversation is still in a superficial manner. You would think at this point in our status of humans, we would really be searching to figure out life outside of Earth. But yet we just go about our business still and don't really think deeply about it. We're not really trying to exist on the frontier anymore. We're really content in many ways. And so anyways, that's the through line, that's the outline of the book in the most simplistic form. Well, I don't know if this was simplistic at all. And now the outline for the podcast, the outline for the conversations that I'm aiming to continue to have. And I say continue because this is sort of how I talk all the time. These are the conversations I have with my friends. These are the dialogues I seek out when I'm online. And these are the thoughts that I write about. So, well, that was my, crazy attempt to, spurred on by the idea of what is human ecology. I think it's not just me that will go off on all these philosophical musings when asked that question. But I think any curious and thinking human, when sat down in a cool environment to converse with someone, has the question asked to them, what is the ecology of humanity? What is human ecology? I think asking that question is the basis of a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. And so as I set forth with the Human Ecology podcast and with my book that I am trying very hard to make very interesting and then trying very hard to publish it so it can be out there in the world and many people can engage with these ideas and try to tackle these big questions as well through a very interesting through line with Iceland as my muse, and then through more writings beyond that, and then definitely back to ideas about the zoo and observations of humans as they interact with different species. The zoo is an incredible fertile breeding ground for these sorts of observations and ideas about human nature. And I'm going to have these sorts of conversations and write these sorts of ideas out there, put them into the world, and I think create a very engaging community around these topics. So I'm not saying human ecology as if I'm some academic person who can tell you some thesis on the ecology of humanity. But I am putting forth this sort of bait, like I'm casting out this idea. And I'm putting bait out there for other curious thinkers, creative artists and intellectuals to say, let's think about the nature of humanity and let's think about where we go from here. So that is an introduction to my concept of human ecology, and I hope that you all enjoy and come along for the wild ride that the endeavor of human ecology is really shaping up to be. And I guess the last point I will make is that it always blows my mind that you type in human ecology into the internet or ask people about these things, and this is sort of an untapped niche of conversation, of dialogue. Certainly people talk about and research all of these different dynamics, but to put it all under the umbrella of human ecology, I think there's something to that. So let's see where this goes, shall we?